on project management. Okay, so I'm Mike Frank. I'm at Stanford, and this is Angie Cow and Alvin Tan, who are two graduate students at Stanford who are very knowledgeable about project management, both on the organizational side and the technical side. So in the next 90 minutes, we're going to be going through a number of topics in project management, starting with more conceptual and organizational and moving to some of the technical and nuts and bolts platforms that we use. So for starters, these slides are available at the URL that's listed here, and the TAs are going to paste this into the chat. So you can follow along and check on any links that we have if you're interested. Sometimes there'll be links for further reading or for other resources. Also, one of the points of this webinar is to have a robust question period and question answering. We've got lots of folks on the webinar, which is fabulous. So that means that we may not get a chance to call on every single person and answer every question live. So we've got a couple of different ways to ask questions, but the biggest way is through the Q&A box. So Angie and Alvin are going to be monitoring the Q&A box, and throughout answering questions, we may take a few of those for the question periods at the end of each section and answer those out loud, but we'll try to get to every single question that we get in the question box, at least in text. And then if you want to just chit-chat about things as well, you're also able to put things in the webinar chat, which we've enabled. So you're welcome to kind of share things or comments that aren't exactly questions, so we can have kind of a couple different robust sources of information as we go along. I also want to note that what I'm teaching today is very closely related to, it's based on the approach to project management that we present in experimentology. Experimentology is a new textbook that my co-authors and I have written. We've actually just finished a final revision. We'll get into how many finals there are here and how we track these things in just a minute. But we finished what we think is the last revision or last major revision before it's published. But the textbook is already available on the web live, and it will always be free on the web live, although there will be a publication copy from MIT Press when they get it copy edited and typeset and everything. So that's most of the nuts and bolts here. Please feel free to jump in the chat or in the Q&A box whenever you want with any questions or clarifications. What I'm going to do now is just a very brief intro to the webinar, and then we'll get into the learning goals and the substance. Okay, so this is the crest of the Royal Society with the motto nullius in verba, nothing at its word. It's a kind of a rough translation. And the idea here is that independent verification is a core principle of the scientific endeavor, that what we want to be doing as scientists is creating a body of knowledge that's independent of any person or authority. It allows us to act on the world and understand the world basically, kind of from a neutral perspective as much as possible. Yet the reality is sometimes different, that when you look in somebody's documents folder, even an esteemed scientist, what we get is something a little bit scarier. Things are not quite organized. We wonder whether the basis of this knowledge is actually as solid as we hope. So in the past 15 years or so, we've now established a kind of taxonomy for components of verifiability of a scientific result. This is just terminology. So when you've got the same data set and the same analysis, so you really have the same numerical tabular data file, and you do the same kinds of statistical analyses on it, and you get the same result, we typically call that reproducible or computationally reproducible. If you do the same analysis, but you've collected new data, we often refer to that as replicable, generating those same findings in a new sample. And then we sometimes talk about if we do different analyses on the same data set that are kind of aimed at getting at the same question, but maybe get it in a different way, we might call that a robust finding if we get the same thing. So today we're going to be focusing on reproducibility. That is, how do we make sure that other people and us as well can get the same findings on our data set? Now, that wouldn't seem like it would be hard, but it turns out it's actually a challenge. And the key thesis today is that good project management is going to be a key component of creating reproducible research that in turn is a verifiable contribution to the scientific knowledge base. So we think about research as a pipeline, going from the basic raw data in its most unaltered form, like survey responses, through processing into primary data sets, to kind of what we might think of as pre-processed data that we're able to analyze. Then we do analysis to get quantitative values that we might put in the text from a statistical analysis, or a figure that might illustrate our data, and then eventually dissemination in a report. And the question that we're always asking for computational reproducibility, as well as for project management, is how we ensure the integrity and the comprehensibility of this chain. How do we make sure we know how we got from raw data all the way to the dissemination artifacts, the paper, or whatever we're sharing? My co-author always reminds us to think about Fleetwood Mac's classic album Rumors and say, never break the chain. Okay, I'm paid for the dad jokes here, as you'll soon find out. Alvin and Angie have the memes, but I've got the dad jokes. All right, so this idea of maintaining the analysis pipeline brings up two interrelated issues that I'm going to argue are really flip sides of the same coin. The first is internal organization. How do you organize your own project so that you avoid errors and ensure reproducibility? So you know how you got all the values that you report, and those are organized enough that you could get them again in the same way. But the second issue is, how do you manage your project so that it can be shared and disseminated? Not just the paper, but also the other research products, including the materials, the code, the data, and so forth. How do you create a product and a project that can easily be shared at the end of the process? What I'm going to be arguing today is that these two issues are really the same thing, that if you organize a project well from the start, it will be extremely easy to share and disseminate it in a variety of different forms. The running example that we're going to be using is a simple sample project that I made. I made up the data. There's nothing exciting in this project, but this is a GitHub repository that I made for this webinar. And it has a number of features that we're going to be talking about today as parts of the project management process. It's hosted in an open cloud platform, that is GitHub. So if you click on this link from the slides, then you'll be able to browse this repository and download anything you want. It's version controlled, so you can see how it's been altered over the course of the project, and there's not a lot of alteration that's happened just yet. It's got a clear folder hierarchy with a bunch of easy to recognize and reason about subfolders, like analysis, data, and in data we've got experiments 1 and 2, materials, and write-up. It's got an RStudio project file, which allows you to open the project as a whole in RStudio, which is, of course, the integrated development environment for the R statistical programming language. So these project files, as we'll see, are a really great way to keep track of dependencies and paths within your R code. It's got package versioning, which we'll talk about. So you know which versions of different R packages I've used. It's got a README file that describes its contents quite briefly. And it's got a license that allows you to know what you can do with it for sharing. So this is the general outline of what we're going to be trying to create today. We won't necessarily be doing it on GitHub. We'll be looking at a couple of different tools for disseminating this kind of project. But the general idea, excuse me, the general idea is that we want to learn the principles behind organizing a project like this, and then we're going to move to the specifics of how to organize your project with RStudio and Open Science Framework, or Git. So our learning goals for this webinar, we're going to start by talking about the challenges of project management and the impacts on reproducibility. So this is going to be a bit more on the meta science side. I've already started a little bit down that road, but we'll go a little bit further. Then we're going to apply the principles of project management to one of your projects. So this is going to be a 15-minute presentation plus about 5 minutes for you to do some self-evaluation and to choose a particular project on your computer that you'd like to organize this way. Next, we're going to turn to our studio projects to create organized, reproducible code, focusing on programming in R, although some of the principles there will be broader as well. And then our last goal would be to explore OSF, the Open Science Framework, Google Drive, and GitHub as potential project management platforms enabling sharing. Okay, so please go ahead, and if anybody has questions already, you're welcome to share those in the Q&A or in the chat. I know a couple of more people have joined, so please feel free to reshare the slide link, TAs, and then we will press onward. Okay, let's start with reproducibility. So the first thing I want to tell you about is the problem of error in data analysis. Errors in data analysis are much more common than we would like, and unfortunately, they are very hard to find. Ensuring the integrity of scientific findings is quite challenging. And I say this from personal experience, unfortunately. So this is one of my first published papers. It could be maybe even my first published paper right around the right time. It came from when I was a research assistant working with Scott Johnson at NYU. I took over a project from Jonathan Slemmer, who had tragically passed away, and I completed a set of experiments that he had planned as part of his thesis. So I was very happy and pleased to jump in and do these infancy experiments on rule learning. And I wrote up the paper just as I was starting graduate school and sent it in for review. And figure 1 was this plot of habituation. We showed babies' multimodal rules, A, B, B, so forth, instantiated in shapes and in syllables. These were 5-month-olds. And at dishabituation time, when there was an incongruent rule token, they looked longer than when there was a congruent token. What neither I nor my co-authors nor the 2 reviewers nor the editor noticed was that there was this obvious problem with this graph. The habituation times were extremely low, really impossibly low, because we were cutting off trials at 2 seconds. So some of this made no sense whatsoever. It turned out, of course, that I had averaged the wrong part of the data series together. This was just a couple of random outlier trials, not the main habituation trials at all. I recognized this about 4 years later, three or 4 years later, as I was on a plane, digging into this project for unrelated reasons. And my blood ran cold. I realized that I had really one of my first papers had this big published error in it. Luckily, it didn't compromise the dishabituation test trials, and the other experiments were fine as well. But this is what the eventual figure was supposed to look like. It was supposed to have a real robust habituation curve and then dishabituation, not this odd, improperly scaled set of values in the left-hand panel. So this is probably not the last error that I will make. I'm sure I've made others, but I'm not alone here. One example of this that was immensely consequential was the Reinhardt-Rogoff error. This was an improper formula in an Excel spreadsheet. The Excel spreadsheet was somewhat consequential in that it was created by 2 economists who were arguing for austerity policies right after the Great Recession. The data due to the Excel error appeared to support austerity policies, and many European nations embraced them. Unfortunately, it was just an error, and it wasn't clear that austerity was in fact a good idea. So this comes back to our general guiding issue, which is that organization of data and data analysis is really important. This issue didn't come to light until somebody who was digging into these data requested the original spreadsheet and was able to verify the formula in the columns and find out that there was an error. So, of course, Excel is not a great data analysis tool for the purpose of scientific verifiability. It's really hard to make manifest exactly what computations are underlying a particular value. So much easier to have something like R where you can go through the code and reproduce the code. Okay, here's the general problem, though. We don't know how prevalent these issues are. I just told you 2 anecdotes about problems in project management and reproducibility, scientific errors. And the issue is that there's a lot of dark matter here. We see a small number of studies that have incomplete or improperly curated data available, but there may be much more of this dark matter where we can't even see the incomplete or improperly curated data. We just don't know. And that's because we sometimes don't even know where the data are. This is a questionnaire study by Tenopir et al. So a very small number of respondents, when asked where their data were, selected options consistent with good data practices like discipline-based repositories or institutional repositories. The majority of folks had their data on a PI's server or maybe a departmental server or in a cloud storage format. These are mediocre, but not archival. They don't come with any guarantees, especially, for example, if somebody switches labs or institutions. And many people also endorsed bad data practices, data sets that were only on their personal computer, which is a substantial risk because, as we all know, computer hard drives fail regularly. Okay, so this seems problematic. But again, the scope of the problem is tough to understand. One potential issue is simply that we can't get at many data sets for published papers, so we don't know the extent of errors or unavailability. So when we write to people, and my lab does this sometimes, but this is a nice paper by Teddersu et al., we find that many folks do not answer emails about their data. So data sharing in general in the journals Science and Nature has gone up substantially. That's this second period 2, and it's the black bar. So these journals actually mandate data sharing, and so you get about 60% data sharing. But most people don't write back when you don't share your data, and most journals, or when you ask to share data, and most journals don't mandate data sharing. So overall rates of data sharing are still quite low in psychology, especially. So a number of really creative folks have done some nice work to try to figure out the prevalence of error, even in the absence of data. So this is a paper by Baker and Weikertz. They note that when you report a statistic in APA format, you say T of 46 is 1.28, P equals 0.207. You've got actually 3 pieces of information. You only need 2. You can use the t-value and the degrees of freedom to compute the p-value and so forth. So in order to study the prevalence of errors, they just scrape these statistics out of papers and check whether the 3 numbers line up with one another. Because if they don't, you know that there's something being misreported. You don't know what the source of the error is. Could be just a typo, could be a miscomputation, and so forth. But there's something going on. And what they found is just a substantial number of errors. The proportion of error was extremely high across the papers they sampled. And some of these errors, critically, were what they called gross errors, errors that changed whether the p-value was below or above the decision boundary of 0.05. So this rate of error felt unacceptably high to these authors and feels unacceptably high to me. Here's one more on this particular track. So Nguyen et al. Used automated methods to extract this kind of reporting from papers and found actually that almost half of all papers had some kind of reporting error in it by this standard. And this is a real lower bound on the number of errors that are out there. So these studies started to radicalize me about the prevalence of error in psychology and in the published literature and science more broadly. I started to worry, hey, it's not just me making errors. Actually, everybody makes errors. Some of these are deep and consequential errors. Some of them are just, typos and reporting errors, but this is not good. And around that time, Tom Hardwick, the one with the rumors joke, joined my lab, and he took advantage of this opportunity, which was a mandatory open data policy at the journal Cognition. So a large group of us planned a systematic case study of analytic reproducibility. That is, we went in and downloaded these open data sets and tried to reproduce the particular statistical results down to the exact numbers in one paragraph of the results section. We only did this for the simplest papers, the ones where the statistical analysis was in an introductory stats textbook. So from 35 articles with open reusable data, for these ones in green over here on the right, we are able to reproduce all their values without any help from the authors, and that was really great. For the yellow ones, we had to reach out to the authors, but with the authors' help, we were able to get the information we needed to reproduce all of the values. For the red ones, even with the author's help, there were one or more values in the paper that we were unable to reproduce. So for this example, neither the authors nor we knew where the numbers came from for the confidence interval that was reported in the paper. And you can see that's just this one confidence interval. Here, just one effect size. But for several of these papers, there were quite a number of values that were non-reproducible, even with the author's assistance and the raw data. There were 64 major numerical errors in this data, about 5%. So this empirical assessment of reproducibility really bothered me. It made me think that the prevalence of error in the scientific literature is much higher than previously acknowledged. And it really radicalized me about changing my lab systems to try to prevent those kind of errors and increase organization. So there was no case in this set of 35 where reproducibility issues seriously undermined the substantive conclusions, although we couldn't always tell. But the other thing that really popped out to me here was that these reproducibility attempts, where we would go in and download the data and try to rebuild a piece of the results, just took a tremendous amount of time and effort. It was like putting together an IKEA flat-pack furniture with a vague instruction manual. It had a very high failure rate. It was really a problem of organization and documentation. And we found that this was true not just for cognition, but also for psychological science. We downloaded papers with the open data badge and replicated this reproducibility study, again, led by Tom Hardwick. Okay, so in much of my teaching, I focus on one solution, which is reproducible writing. And I encourage you to look at the webinar from last year that we did for ManyBabies, reproducible writing. The idea is that you take R code and combine that with the data and render your paper, and that allows you to know transparently which piece of code is responsible for which part of your paper, and really document that provenance chain from data through analysis to the paper. I still believe that that's really important, and that is what my lab does for the majority of our papers. But today, I want to focus on project management as the key failure point. This is one of the this is publicly published, but it's anonymized because I didn't want to call this person out. I actually think they did the right thing and were incredibly responsive to seeing that there was an error in the data they had uploaded. So they corrected their paper at Cognition after we corresponded with them. And what they said was, the file I submitted to Cognition is loaded with errors. I edited this file before submitting it, and honestly, I have no idea what went wrong in that process. So what they reported there is essentially a failure of project management. They didn't have a clear version of the data file to upload, so they didn't have a final data file that was used in their analysis. They were doing editing. They didn't have some sort of versioning system to keep track of that editing. And so as a result, they ended up submitting the wrong data file, even though they had the right one. And as a result, their paper was non-reproducible. So the basic thesis of this webinar then is that project management is a major failure point. Managing research projects appropriately is this foundational prerequisite for reproducibility, both for checking the integrity of papers and then for sharing those out and making the materials and research products that you create as impactful as possible. Okay, so I'll pause here briefly for questions about the meta science or the general ideas here, and then we'll dive into project management principles. Okay. You're ready to get to the meat of this webinar. Thank you, Sylvia. Okay, so let's talk about applying the principles of project management to one of your projects. So here are the key principles that we are going to be following here. For each project, we want one name for the project. We want one version of each file in the project. with the correct name given its context. We want a folder hierarchy that creates context for those files. And we want to keep all of the raw data for this project along with documentation about how they were collected. Let's go through each of these in turn. So we're going to be talking about projects by a single name. The project name is going to be something that's short, that's memorable, and that in your stable of projects is unique. So back when I was studying a lot of pragmatic communication, my first project was called Pragmatics because I didn't know I was going to do that. And that turned out to be a terrible name. So then I ended up with a lot of Pragbat and Praglook and Pragtouch and so forth, all of these Prag type titles. Now my lab does a bit more other stuff. So we've got titles like KidDraw, BabyView-Bing, Kid Culture, and so forth. This project name is used for a lot of stuff. It's the prefix on the file name. So you want something like KidDraw manuscript.rmd. It's the project directory name. So in my computer, I have a folder called projects. And then in there are all of these, including KidDraw, BabyView-Bing, Kid Culture, and otherwise. It's very good for searching for those project folders when you don't know where something is. It's going to be the name of the associated cloud storage repository, like your GitHub repository. It's for my lab that uses Slack a lot for chat. It's going to be the name of our Slack channel. It's generally the tag for the project. It's a great search term. It's how you refer to the project. And you want to be very disciplined about this. Choose how you write it out. Always write it the same way. And it's always going to be a way that you can find things associated with this project. The directory named for the project name, and there's going to be one of those on your computer, exactly one, is going to be called the project root. It's the root of the directory. I should draw upward. My metaphor should go up. The root of the directory tree that branches upward out into all of these different leaves that are the directories where subdirectories or subfolders where all of your files live. Okay, why are we talking about files? Well, every project, all of its research products are going to be instantiated in digital files. It's kind of obvious, but that's how we do things these days. So code, data, manuscript, and so forth, lots and lots of different stuff. And each file in a project is going to have a name, which with an extension on it. It's got a location, for example, projects, info, materials. It's got a format. That .txt extension makes it plain text. It's got the contents of the file. That's actually the experimental script. It's got some metadata. It was last edited by me on this date at this time. All of these pieces of information are going to be important for tracking and organizing these files. But they're important in different ways. What I'm going to suggest is when you name the file, you need to name the file after what it contains. The context should not be in the file's name. The file's location provides that context, where it is in this subfolder hierarchy. Similarly, the metadata should not be in the file name. Let the platform of storage, and I'll show you how GitHub and OSF and even Google Drive all provide this, take care of that metadata. So I've worked with a number of people, and I've done this myself, where we have file names that are very organized. And we've got info kid E1 script 2024-2-3 draft 1 mcf.txt. This is the work of hopefully of quite an organized person. There's a lot of information in here, but this person is making a fundamental mistake. They're putting metadata into the name. So here's just a quick audience participation check. What problems might you see with putting metadata in the file names? It could be wrong, exactly. Yes. So it's not updated. So when I edit this file tomorrow, unless I'm ultra organized, I'm not going to update the name to reflect this. And so the name is going to immediately be wrong. And when I send it to somebody else, do they stick their name on the end? They keep sticking their names on the end forever? Yep. Inconsistency across collaborators from Sylvia, exactly. Formatting can be inconsistent. So all of these problems can come up, even though I'm trying to be so organized, unless I'm just ultra disciplined and have really, really good hygiene with these file names, and I train everybody I work with to do this, it can go wrong. Here's a meme How it started is final draft.docx, and then of course how it's going is final draft v20 copy 1, right? So when you name something final, you're putting metadata about the paper, hopeful metadata here essentially, into the name. What you want to call this is manuscript, and when it's final, it's the last version of the manuscript. Okay, so I've got a great question. Okay, since like Alvin is answering Divya's question about whether this is a continuous running document. So the idea behind this project folder right now is this is how the files and research products from your project are going to be organized on your computer. In the third substantive section of the webinar, I'm going to talk about how this is going to get shared out. So the idea is if we organize the project right on our own computer, we can manage that through a cloud repository, and then this can be shared with everybody involved in the project internally, and then it can be shared externally at the end of the project, minus any privacy-related concerns of raw data sharing or licensed materials. Okay. Let me press onward here. Okay, so just a quick aside on cloud storage and formats. We're going to be talking more about this in a moment, but the basic principle that I want to tell you, and this maybe sound a little bit radical to some folks, but 2 copies of any file means trouble. As soon as there are 2 copies of a file, whatever that file is, an alarm should go off on your head, because all of a sudden you are responsible for knowing which of those 2 copies is the right one. Excuse me. This could be because you sent a copy of something to someone. Could be because you made 2 copies on your own system. As soon as you have those 2 copies, all of a sudden you have to have that pointer on there saying like, this is the right one, this is the right one. And every time you make an error with that pointer, you're going to have to pay some cost of reconciling these 2 things. So the problems that can come up, you don't remember which one of these is the right one. One's called final and one called final. You edit the wrong copy or make conflicting changes. The wrong copy can be used in downstream analyses or even shared out, as in the case of the cognition one that I was telling you about. I think that the classic example of this kind of conflict is the advisor who makes 1,000 track changes on the wrong version of your Word doc. You get it back and you're like, no, I fixed all that stuff. Why did you make those changes? And the answer is because you sent them a copy and they worked from that copy. And they didn't have that pointer at all times saying, no, this is the version of record. So cloud platforms solve the 2 versions issues. A single authoritative copy of a research project, a data, code, or a paper means that you don't ever share or edit or rely on the wrong version. And this authoritative cat here has this clear message, which is that means you cannot send email attachments of your docx file. It's fine if you want to work in Microsoft Word, but you have to share that using a cloud platform as a link. Every time you email that document back and forth, you create a risk that you will have 2 conflicting versions and you create more work for yourself. Winecat says only share links. Okay, you may be thinking, but what if you want multiple versions? What if you're not sure and you want to make a branch? We'll talk about this later. But the hard and fast rule here is 1 version of the file, 1 location where it is stored, and you send a link to that rather than sending the file itself. Okay, next principle, folder hierarchy creates the context for files. Where a file lives can tell you exactly what it is, and that is an appropriate method for reducing ambiguity about what's in a file. For example, in the materials directory, you can have infokid experiment1 script.txt, or you could just have materials experiment1 script.txt. There is no one right answer to this question. There's lots of different ways, but if you think that names are incredibly important and you stop and think about the name of a file and whether it is as clear as possible, you're going to end up with a project management directory, a project folder that is well organized and that is transparent and that's going to serve you well. And this includes choosing good names for folders like materials, data, raw data, like really clear, transparent names that reflect the life cycle of a project. Try to avoid folders like old, not needed, misc, stuff, and so forth. One attendee asks how we handle backup files. So if you are sharing this, or if you're using a cloud platform like GitHub or Google Drive or the OSF as your storage platform for this project folder, you are automatically backed up into the cloud. And so that provides a really good backup. So that's my general advice, is that you can use the cloud platform both as your organization and hosting medium and also as your backup. It's also good practice to have a backup of your computer, but I never work from that backup. I'm not at any risk of like opening up the backup, double clicking the manuscript and immediately starting to write in the wrong version. So really what I'm talking about is having two versions of the manuscript in the same folder. I hope that answers your question. Okay. So some people feel so strongly about this folder hierarchy that they have a very specific system for folder hierarchies. This is the project tier hierarchy. So the tier protocol is this specific protocol for psychological research and the folders. They have folder called data, input data, metadata, analysis data, intermediate data, scripts, output, and so forth. I think this is a very organized, very clear way to put together your folders. It doesn't work for every project I work on, and I also don't love writing things in caps like this, but I think this is a totally reasonable standard that you can follow. What I do is very slightly different, but pretty similar. Here's the folder hierarchy that I made up for this running example, but this looks like a lot of our lab's projects. So I've expanded all of the subfolders here and just taken a screenshot. You can see here's the analysis directory, experiment 1 analysis, the data. I've got experiment 1 and experiment 2 data files. Maybe I should have named these experiment 1 data, but maybe not. I think either way is fine. And then I'll talk a bit more about these other files here: license, project management.rproj, the project file, and the README, and then the package manager. And then I've made an error here. This should be materials script.txt, and then write-up. So my materials got messed up here. Yes, I do recommend including a README file for each project. Whether you need a README in each folder depends on how complicated the folder is. I think you can over-document things. In this particular case, I don't need a README sitting in here with experiment 1 and one file called data, because there's literally only one thing going on there. On the other hand, if you have like the raw data and the process data, and there's some kind of script that you need to call for the processing and it's not clear, then documenting that would be really nice. Okay, and for this next incoming question, so I'm going to be talking a bit about cloud hosting. GitHub is one option here for sharing this kind of stuff. So is OSF, so is Google Drive. There are different ways of working with each cloud provider, and sort of different discipline needed for each of these. So we'll come to all of those questions later. And Kimberly asks, where are the metadata? Are they in the README file? Oh, great question. So the metadata are going to be stored by our cloud platform. So every time you upload something to Google Drive, it knows when you uploaded it. And if you make edits to it, it actually tracks those edits. That's true for Google Drive. Same thing is true for GitHub. Every time you push a new version of a file to Google Drive, it actually tracks exactly what has changed about those, exactly who did the push. There's even a comment on that. It's called a commit message that tells you what was done and so forth. Okay, so next up, READMEs. Every project needs a README file in the project root, the main directory of the project. That README file should be called something like README. This is a convention that allows us to know exactly what you want us to look at first. The README describes the relations to the academic product. So for example, it might say, this is the stuff for these papers or this one paper. This is all the materials. It might explain the file hierarchy in case it's some different in some way than what you might expect. It might make links to other resources. so additional data or file storage. And it might include contact info or other information to get in touch with you or to get involved in the project or something like this. Okay, a few points now about specifically managing raw data and data for psychological studies. So the biggest principle here, again, is back to Fleetwood Mac, never break the chain. So you got to save your raw data. You need to maintain reproducibility from the raw data all the way to the paper that you write about them. And the raw data provide what you might think of as an audit trail in case of any later issue, any question, any error. You can show how you got from what you collected from the participants all the way to the published product. Now, raw data do pose some issues, and I'm not going to go deeply into this. We can talk a little bit about it in the chat or Q&A. But raw data may require a different storage solution than the rest of your project. So sometimes raw data do not live in the project folder, project directory, and get shared in exactly the same cloud platform. There are two big reasons that come up for this. The first is privacy concerns. So if you're sharing all your research products openly through Open Science Framework or through GitHub, you can't do that for potentially identifying information like participants' dates of birth or their verbal responses, or of course, things like their name. So you may have to store those elsewhere. Sometimes that's as simple as just removing those from a version of the file that you put in your cloud repository. Sometimes you've got something much bigger like eye tracking data or video recordings that pose these kinds of larger issues. There you may need to investigate another domain-specific repository like a video repository or an institutional repository that allows you to put things in a secure private place. Yeah, same thing for, I won't have much to say about sharing things like EEG data here, but this is Xiaoyun's question. But just to say a little bit about that kind of issue, the basic solution is you do everything we're talking about for all of the project except for the data files. And then the data files get shared through an alternative solution. Excuse me. So you use something like a Dataverse server or something like this to share a big pile of data files. And then in the README, you say, hey, none of this code will work. This is a whole project, but none of it will work unless you download all of the data from this other repository and put it in the following directory. Okay. So you got to save your raw data. And to the extent that you use spreadsheets, just a quick word about organizing these so that they're a good player in this project management ecosystem. Spreadsheets should always be rectangular. I'll say a bit more about this in a moment. The same things I've said about file names, about choosing good names, is really important for variable names in spreadsheets. Subject underscore ID is a very clear name. You can, if you like capitalizing things, you can use sub ID. You probably shouldn't put special characters like number in there. Sex is a perfectly good name. Female is a good alternative, and that can be true or false. Then you don't have any coding problems about what 1 or 0 means. So if you name the variable female, 1 means female. You should probably avoid both the special character and this ambiguous M/F. Without context, it's very hard to figure out what that means. RT milliseconds, it's got the units in there, that's good. An alternative might be reaction time in milliseconds, or but try to avoid the periods and the verbose names. So you want something that's machine readable. And then formatting of a spreadsheet is not data. So if you have a spreadsheet with lots of cells that are orange to mean exclude them and green to mean put them in, when that's in a reproducible pipeline with some R code, the R code is not going to have access to that formatting. So a rectangular spreadsheet with consistent cell formats, no formatting, and generally a plain text format, all of those promote machine readability, which allows you to automate that pipeline using R code from the raw data all the way to the published paper. Just one word, just to promote this wonderful paper on data organization in spreadsheets. The principle here basically is that tidy data is rectangular data, a rectangular spreadsheet. Like mouse ID and then the sex and the week and the date and all of the measurements. This is a very nice and easy to understand and to analyze with software data set. These non-rectangular data sets with lots of white space are easy for humans to read, but very hard to analyze using R, and the formats can become inconsistent and they can lead to errors. So rectangular spreadsheets are both good data hygiene and also very, very useful for creating these reproducible pipelines. I won't say too much more about this, but I really encourage you to look at this paper, Data Organization and Spreadsheets. It's just a wonderful, easy to read guide to this topic. Once you've got a spreadsheet, once you've got raw data, whatever this is, if it's tabular data, you need to document that data format. This is often called creating a code book or a data dictionary. This is sometimes a tab, sometimes another CSV file. I prefer it to be a separate CSV file called codebook that gives all of the names of the variables, what type of variable they are, what their levels are, and then some explanation. In our reproducibility studies, it was shocking how often the failure mode was, I just don't know what this column means. So what's very clear to you as a data analyst that this column contains a particular kind of information may be unclear to folks who are just opening up your data file and don't have that context. Okay, final piece here is that you need to document your data collection. Often in my lab, this means that there is a run sheet for a particular experiment. A run sheet is a sheet that says the date of test, some kind of age measurement, who did the testing, the participant ID, and some other metadata. Here's another example on the right. It's just a log of what was run, which conditions, who collected them, what settings, and so forth. This is for more of an online mechanical Turk experiment. The key principle is whatever form this documentation takes, you need to be able to match the time, date, and participant ID number to a specific documentation of what experimental protocol was being used. So the idea of documenting the data collection is you can always figure out what version of the script was run on somebody, what materials were administered, which code was used in the web experiment, whatever that is. Okay, all right, so we're now at the end of this principle section. What I want to do now is answer some questions while you do this exercise. And the exercise is the following. Choose a project that you're working on or that you have worked on. Create a fresh directory for that project and start copying things in to try to organize it as transparently and clearly as possible. So you don't want some huge sprawling project for this exercise unless you're, just want to give it a try. Typically, this is like a single paper. And what I want you to try to do is create a copy and make subdirectories for materials, data, analysis, and writing, and copy in these files from the original and try to rename them as clearly as you can. So remember, our cheat sheet is one name for the project, one version of each file. Try to be thoughtful about the right name for that file. The name should reflect the contents of the file, not the metadata. And then a folder hierarchy that creates context. Can you make a project that you would feel proud of that's organized so well that you would say, hey, I'm just going to show this to anybody I work with, and an outsider would immediately recognize the function of every file in the project? So I'm going to pause here and answer questions. We're going to stay here for, I don't know, let's say 3 minutes, 4 minutes as you just begin this process and get a flavor for what it feels like to look at an old project just purely with organization and clarity in mind. So Ashley has asked a question about using acronyms for file names and project names. I think there's a real trade-off here. Acronyms can be non-transparent for people. On the other hand, writing out a really long project code is also hard. My lab probably has a mix of acronyms and kind of silly names. I think on the balance, I like the silly names a bit better because they're pronounceable. But a pronounceable acronym is or a nice backronym or something is a beautiful thing. Um, so Angie's got a project, I'll call her out, called PokeBaby, which is it started out as a joke about Pokemon, but is becoming about a joke about poking babies, trying to get their attention. So that, or kid culture, or that kind of name, that typically works a bit better for me. But if an acronym works for you and you think it's transparent enough, then that can be good. Okay, anonymous attendees asks, how do you manage access to project materials? For example, some people should not have access to certain information. Great question. So when we get to cloud platforms, all of the cloud platforms that we're looking at, Drive, OSF, and GitHub, all have somewhat granular access controls. So in the case of something like GitHub, I probably wouldn't put condition assignments into a public or even to a project team repository if I wanted to keep people blind to them. So that's a case where I might store that in a separate repository that had different permissions, or store it in a Google Drive file that was not in that project root or that had very specific permissions associated with it. Yeah, so in general, when you have kind of different visibility requirements for specific pieces of a project, it could be your keys for posting to Amazon Mechanical Turk or something like that, or it could be participant identifying information, or it could be something like assignment to condition in a blinding study. You will want to put those in escrow somewhere else. So this organization we're talking about here is kind of the default project tree, but those files might have to go somewhere else. Jan K asks about organizing by project codes. I try to be organized, but I work with a lot of different people, and so I don't have a table of all of the project codes. I kind of remember most of the big ones, and hopefully they're transparent enough that it's not so hard to figure out what they are. So kid culture, okay, I know that's the project that's about kid culture. Baby view or BV Bing. That's when we put the baby view at the Bing Nursery School, that kind of thing. So I in another world, I've tried this a couple times and I've failed to keep it up to date. But in another world, I'd have a really good spreadsheet of all the projects I was working on. But in practice, when I work with students, I mostly manage it by thinking about, oh, this student has the following projects going on. I don't have the exhaustive list. Oops. So I'm going to send over the rest of the questions to the TAs now, actually, because I'm going to try to press onward with our material. The one thing I want to answer here is our anonymous attendee who asks whether we separate out demographic information from other data types and then merge them later. Great question. So there's lots of different ways to do this workflow. If you have a single source of demographic information that is used in multiple projects, you might want to store that elsewhere and pull that in to make sure that that's definitive. Demographic information is often also constrained by privacy regulations. So if there's a database where that lives, you might want to figure out a way that projects could pull de-identified versions of that in. So this could be as simple as a institutionally approved Google Sheet, and then some kind of API call to that to download it. It could be, so that each project downloads the same Google Sheet, or it could be something more sophisticated. But yeah, I agree that thinking about placing shared information outside of the project is an important way to make sure that that doesn't get duplicated in ways that are kind of complicated. Okay. All right, I hope that this exercise of looking at one of your projects with sharing an organization in mind has been helpful. So next, I want to move on and talk a little bit about using RStudio projects to create organized, reproducible code in particular. So many of the attendees, I think most of the attendees to the webinar indicated that they use RStudio and R. And so the basic idea here is we want to organize our R project. So this is a quote from Jenny Bryan, I believe, shared by Hadley Wickham. The first line of your R script is set working directory to users Jenny path that only I have. I will come into your office and set your computer on fire. This was a little controversial. Maybe it's a little stridently described, but I think the general principle is right. And here's a more measured version of Jenny Bryan saying this. What you want to do is use RStudio's built-in project management function, which is RStudio projects. The idea is to organize every data analysis for a particular product into a project, a folder on your computer that holds all the files. We've been talking about that. Then within that project, any R script is written, assuming it'll be run from a fresh R process, working inside that project with the directory set to that project's root. And then the project can be moved around on your computer or onto other computers, and it'll still just work. She makes this really strong claim. This is the only practical convention that creates reliable, polite behavior across different computers. It's like agreeing we'll all drive on the left or the right. It's a hallmark of civilization. So she's really got this kind of strong view, which I like. So RStudio, as I said, is this integrated development environment, or IDE. Makes it easy to manage multi-file projects, and it even manages version control for you if you want. RStudio project is a feature of RStudio, which I'll show you in just a moment. Basically, what that does is it creates an rproj file that's associated with a particular directory. And when you open that rproj file, it opens a separate session of R that's distinct from all those other ones that are open, that has only the stuff that you open in that project folder. It's based in that project folder, and you can edit the code for that project folder and run it. And the workspace is then for that project. Our projects also enable a number of tools for path and package management, allowing you to keep track of where files live and what libraries you're using, what packages you're using for your analysis. So in RStudio, we're now getting into the nuts and bolts here. You may never have looked at this feature, but when you go to File, you've got New File, and then you've got New Project. We're going to be using New Project here. When you hit New Project, you can start a new directory. You can create a project in an existing directory, which is what we're going to do with your example. And then you can also check out a project from a version control repository. So if you have a GitHub link, like the one that I circulated for our example project, you can actually download from that GitHub link. And so that would create a copy of the project that's in GitHub on your local computer with an R project associated with it. Now, you might be thinking that's creating a copy. Didn't you say that was bad? Excuse me. That's a very particular circumstance, which we'll talk about a little bit in the case of Git. So if you're creating from an existing directory, you'll want to set the directory on your computer that project is going to live in. That's going to be this new project, organized project directory. And then you're going to click Open in New Session. And that's that key checkbox that's going to create a brand new, fresh, clean R session that allows you to manipulate just the files and variables and so forth from that particular project. Okay, and here's what this looks like. Creating that project is just going to create a .rproj file that indexes that in the folder for your project. This is my general projects directory. You can see I've got all these different project codes here, some somewhat more or somewhat less transparent. And then here's my folder hierarchy. And if I double click on that project management.rproj, that's going to open up a brand new R session for me where I can manipulate these files and be in the right directory and so forth. Okay, so just a little bit more about paths. So set working directory, this command to get you to the right place for your R session so you can run files and read in data files and so forth. It's actually quite fragile and dependent on the way you organize your file. So if I read CSV, this particular file in this directory, that's going to work only on my computer and only when my project is in this particular place. Using our projects gets you to the root directory wherever you are. But I want to introduce you now to this package called here, which is a very simple R package that allows you to create easy file references, even for deeper sets of subdirectories. It's very, very clear, very useful, and very portable. The basic idea is here knows where the top level directory of the project is. It knows where the project root is, and then it builds paths for you based on the project root. So what I would do to use here is I would read CSV and then I would say here. So starting at my project root in the data directory, and then the file experiment1.csv. So here is going to build the path to this experiment1.csv based on whether, where the project is and whether I want slashes or backslashes, whether I'm on a PC or a Mac or a Linux box, it doesn't matter. Here is going to build the correct path starting from the project root with this subfolder and then this file name. And so that means when I transfer it to your PC, it's still going to work. You're still going to be able to read this file in. And that's a really very powerful thing for portability. So I really try to use the here package essentially everywhere. Okay, so that's one kind of problem that comes up when we talk about sharing projects is the paths to the projects. A second problem that constantly comes up is the packages that you have installed on your computer aren't the same packages that somebody else has installed on their computer. So the kind of nightmare scenario here is, what if LME4, that's the classic mixed effects model package, upgrades, and then all of a sudden all of your mixed effects models don't converge or say something different? This has happened to us. We were actually working with collaborators and they sent us a data set and they said, we've run these mixed effect models and we find the following thing. And some time had gone by for whatever reason. Research always takes time. And we ran the mixed effect models again and we got something totally different. And we're like, what's happening here? Eventually, after a lot of debugging and discussion, we realized the data were the same, the code was the same. The only thing that was different was the version of LME4. There had been an upgrade to LME4, and some models didn't work that used to work, some models that didn't work now worked. The numbers were all different and so forth. We had run into a problem of package versioning. That's the technical term. So we needed to store not just the code, but also the particular versions of the package that we were using so that our collaborators could see the same thing. This is a bit of an advanced topic. It's mostly important when you're sharing analyses across multiple collaborators that are coding on it. But there is now a pretty good solution to this problem. And the solution is called RENV, which stands for R environment. So RENV is a package that creates reproducible environments for you. The idea is within your R project, and this is all going to happen within that R project, when you initialize the RENV package with RENV init, it's going to look at all of the different packages that you use in your project. It's going to download that version of them and make your own package library. And it's going to create a file called a lock file that says, these are the versions of the package you use. And when you install new packages, you're going to have to update. Excuse me. You're going to have to update your RENV. And then that RENV lock file can be shared with other collaborators. And then they do a RENV restore. And RENV will automatically download exactly the same version of the packages that you have to their computer just for that project. So it won't mess up all of their other projects and all of their other versions. This will be a project-specific library of packages. And that's a really wonderful thing. So one of my projects can use the newest version of LME4, but that's when I update that, it's not going to mess up all of my other projects that use older versions of it. Otherwise, all your projects have to be in lockstep with each other in terms of the packages, and that's very, very challenging. So RENV solves that problem in a really nice way. Okay. Ismail asks in the chat, to take a snapshot for a project. Yeah, you have to have that R project file open. So when you're working in a session for that R project file, if you init renv, if you initialize renv, then it will be initialized for that project. So all of this workflow is around that idea of a single project folder. Everything is in the subfolders. Okay, so let's go on to the practicum section here. So again, we're going to pause for about 3 minutes. I'll take questions while we do so. And what I want you to do is, with this previous project that you've just begun the process of reorganizing, I want you to open up RStudio and create a new RStudio project associated with the main project folder for your project. Then if you want, you can try loading a file from a subdirectory using the here package. You don't have to do this if you want to get some R code going. But what I really want you to do is to close your project, then reopen it simply by double-clicking the R project file in that directory. So practicing that way of working, where in order to start work on the project, you automatically are opening that new R session that is specific to your project. You should see your R window should have a badge on it. When you switch to the window, it should have a little badge that says the project name across it. So you know that session is specific to that project. And then if you're really feeling ambitious, you can try initializing renv and installing a package using renv install. Okay, so I'll pause here for questions. We'll take about 3 minutes on this. Okay, Anna asks, how do we link the main project folder on our laptop to something like Google Drive? Great question. So what we're talking about right now is simply principles of project organization. So right now we've got a locally managed project where there's exactly one copy of the thing, and that one copy is on your computer. That's not great from the perspective of sharing or disseminating or even backing up. But right now, it all lives in one place and there's a definitive version. The only problem is you can't share it. So in the last section here, we're going to talk about workflows for sharing this folder out using cloud platforms. There are advantages and disadvantages to each of those cloud platforms. There were a bunch of really thoughtful questions in the Q&A about how you deal with many projects that use the same data set or projects that become multiple projects. Angie and Alvin have some nice different guidance here. One thing that I would say is be open to reorganizing. Sometimes you choose an organizational choice that to have everything in one big folder, and then it turns out that's not going to make sense. Once you figure that out, you can do what's called refactoring. You can try to recreate a new project organization that makes more sense. So for example, maybe you have one big folder and you get to the point of wanting to disseminate and you realize, actually, this was really 2 projects and I've written a paper about the first half. At that point, as soon as you start recognizing that, it's time to try out a reorganization. Maybe you can split off a new project folder for the second part that's ongoing that isn't in the paper. Or maybe it makes sense to keep it together. You decide that's not a good organization. Here's where having a version-controlled repository would be great, but we'll get there. If you're just dragging things around on your computer, that's okay. Just make a copy while you're doing that reorg, while you're keeping that pointer. You're saying, okay, this is a copy and I'm trying out my reorganization. And at the end of the reorganization, I'm either going to go with the reorged version or the normal version. So I think it's important to be open to different organizational ideas. As soon as you start to realize, hey, this folder structure, this organization doesn't make sense, go in there and try to fix it. My students, Angie and Alvin included, although maybe they haven't seen this because they're so organized themselves, my students know that the first thing I often do when somebody shares a project with me is I start dragging things around and trying to understand what everything is. So I will often pull down their GitHub repository and then propose a reorganization and push that back up as the first thing I do, just trying to rename things and keep it all rationalized and organized. And I always understand that, as you're working, things get a little bit messy, but then the next step is always to pull it all back so that you are sure you know what you have. Oh, and Angie has got a great suggestion in the chat that I want to promote here. She likes to draw out the structure of the folder before actually starting to move things around using Miro. That's super organized and a really good idea, and really critical when you've got complex projects with lots of moving parts to have a good kind of diagrammatic organization of it. If you think of this not just as like, okay, just kind of something you have to do, but really as part of the research, then getting organized and really sketching out the way you want to set up your file structure is really quite a good idea. Okay, onward. Okay, last piece that I want to cover here today is cloud management. So the basic idea here is that we've been talking about project management in a single platform. If you set up your project really carefully, say in a local way, then sharing it is going to be trivially easy. And the reason for that is it's all organized and you just have to decide what's shareable from there. So a key and important step in thinking about public sharing is trying to understand the restrictions on sharing and the timeline of sharing. So there could be some cases where you absolutely have to be sharing data and some cases where you can't. So there may be ethical or privacy limitations on sharing, contract or data use agreements, but they're also so those are often negative, but there may also be journal and funder mandates where you absolutely have to be sharing. So trying to understand what those regulatory constraints on you are is a really important first step. But often the discussion has been about data sharing alone, and data sharing is very important, but also one of the trickiest pieces to navigate because of privacy concerns, because of space concerns, and so forth. There are often very few restrictions on sharing the study protocol, the materials, the documentation, the analysis scripts, and of course the research reports and any intermediate analysis you have there. All of that stuff is very shareable and it really adds value to your research product, your end paper, if people have access to all of the pieces that went into it. They'll get reused, they'll get scrutinized and analyzed. People will be very interested in that, and it'll be a very good way to add value to your contribution. For each project, it's useful to decide when you want to share, whether it's as the data are being collected or at the time of submission or at the time of publication, or even sometimes after an embargo if you feel that it's really important to hold on to the data privately for a little while. But having some kind of sharing plan there is really critical. And then the key thing for sharing is that you want something that is fair, that is findable. It's discoverable to humans and machines with a unique identifier like a DOI and some metadata. It's accessible, so it's preserved across the long term via the DOI or the URL. It's interoperable, so it's in a format that both people and machines can understand. And it's also reusable. It's well organized, as we've been talking about, and documented, and also licensed. So I've been arguing that everything should be shared by default, with some restrictions especially for raw data based on licensing and privacy and also size. I'm not going to get into the key regulation here much. Just note that HIPAA and GDPR are the key regulatory frameworks in the US and Europe, respectively. But in general, data are shareable if they are completely de-identified. And that process of de-identification can be a little bit tricky for more complex data sets, but for simple ones, it just consists of removing a list of identifiers. And again, there are very few restrictions on sharing other research products like code and like materials, both of which can be very, very impactful in terms of your contribution. Last piece I want to say about this is about licensing. The reason to license your shared materials is that if you do not have a license, people don't know what they can do with the materials. Licenses are especially important for materials like images or measures, questionnaires, surveys, these sorts of things. If people want to use those in the future, having a license on them is really critical so that they know what their legal rights are, and software packages as well. We often use either Creative Commons style licenses. This would be good for materials. So CC0 says you can do anything with a particular piece of the materials. CC BY says you need to give attribution every time you use it. And CC BY NC says you have to give attribution, and it's also only licensed for non-commercial use. So some people, when they create surveys or questionnaires, like to use CC BY NC so that they're not creating something that someone else can commercialize. When I say these things need to be licensed, that basically means putting a file called license in your project repository that tells people what the license is. That is what they legally are allowed to do with this research artifact. Okay, last piece that we want to get to is cloud sharing. To share projects, they need to live in the cloud. There are lots of common platforms that provide ways to share files and documents. They allow you to share and put permissions on documents. They essentially create a backup by virtue of being a version of your data. They provide versioning and metadata support, so they tell you when things get changed. And they allow you to comment or track issues around the files. And some of them provide archival storage. So Google Drive is a very simple way to create a version, to store your project. So if all of these files from the project, this whole hierarchy, lives in Google Drive rather than on your individual machine, you have a workflow now by which you can share with collaborators. There's a single definitive version of all of this a material that you have. It's very, very easy to use, drag and drop. It's got great comments, got good permissions. Obviously the integration with docs and slides and sheets and so forth. And many people don't know this about Google Docs, but each of the documents in Google is versioned. So you can see the revision history. You never need to make two different copies. So you could track the revisions. You simply go to the little clock icon at the top of the Google Drive file, and you can see how it's changed over time. So Google Drive is a great first step in cloud-based management of projects. Essentially, all we've been doing with this local folder, that could just be happening in a Google Drive folder. You can even install the Google Drive extension so you're working from that on your PC or Mac as though it were a local folder, but it's being updated in Google Drive. If you use more storage, Sylvia notes, you do have to pay for this. That's true, and different institutions have different deals. Google Drive is not a dissemination platform. It is not archival. There's no permanence guarantee, and links are generated or owned by a single account that can go away or change. So Google Drive is not intended to provide permanent public-facing storage for a project. So I dragged my project folder into Google Drive just to show what this looks like. So here it is in my drive, and I could work from this and do writing, and I would have my manuscript in here. I think Google Drive is a fabulous way to collaborate on files in the cloud, but it is not a long-term solution for sharing, and it's also not great for sharing code because it can't version code very easily. The versioning really works for Google Docs and Google Sheets and Google Slides, not for plain text code files. So, Kimberly notes that they're using SharePoint. Something like SharePoint is another solution here that allows you to collaborate and have a single place where all of the project files live. Same thing for SharePoint. There are pros and cons to both, but the basic idea is that these are great ways to have a single version of your project for your collaborators. It's not going to be great for code-based collaboration, and it's not going to be great for sharing. But it is a really nice way to have a well-organized project for your collaborator group. GitHub is a powerful version control system, which includes some support for branching and flexible permissions for contribution. It is great for code. and it has some very powerful project management features. For example, issue tracking, grouping issues together, and so forth. GitHub is not archival. It's often treated this way, but there are no guarantees. The main con is that it's more complex to use. And the other con that people note is that if you're writing together with somebody, it doesn't have within document comments the same way Google Docs does. So just briefly, I'm going to mention a little bit about what version control is. Really, just to intro this topic, the intent in this webinar is not to go through all of version control by any means. So version control is a system for tracking revisions, again, within a project folder. So it's set up with this project workflow. And the system that GitHub uses is called Git. Git is the software that runs locally, where you make changes to a project and you add them into the repository, and you commit a version of that project. And then you can pull down a version from the cloud or push up a version to the cloud. So it's a way to synchronize your local repository with an authoritative cloud version. GitHub is a particular website that hosts those Git repositories. So Git is the software and GitHub is the platform online. I think this can be very, very confusing, so I'll try to give an analogy here, and then basically just provide some resources for if you want to learn a bit more about Git and GitHub. So basically the idea here is if you think about having some kind of photo sharing platform, take a photo, you kind of get everything set, you add all the people to your photo, you compose the photo, and then you click commit, you take the picture of the photo, and then you push that up to the cloud. You upload it to Instagram. This is my class, Psych 251 Instagram, which doesn't exist, unfortunately. So the idea is you're pushing this up to the cloud. But then somebody else, now this is where the Instagram thing looks a little different. Say somebody was not in that photo. They could pull down that photo. So download it from Instagram back down to their phone, add somebody else in there who wasn't in the original photo. You Photoshop them in and edit the picture. You commit, you recapture the picture, and then you push it back up to that Instagram account, and things are updated. So GitHub here is Instagram, and Git is the software that manages all of these adds and commits and pushes up and down. So when I showed you this particular repository at the beginning, this is a GitHub repository where I have created my local copy and organized everything just right, and then pushed that up to GitHub to create that authoritative shared version, and then somebody else using it could pull that back down. So a few more Git resources for you. Experimentology, the textbook that I mentioned at the beginning, has an appendix that provides a more in-depth tutorial for how to start working with Git and GitHub. GitHub itself also has a Get Started page that has tons of really great links. Okay, last example I want to give is Open Science Framework. The Open Science Framework is an online platform for archiving files and pre-registrations and sharing out materials. The OSF is very simple and easy to work with. It's got great permission structure and sharing. One thing that's really important is it has fabulous archival guarantees, so it's guaranteed to remain accessible. And it's got integration with Drive and GitHub. So critically, if you use Google Drive or you use GitHub, you can connect your OSF account to that storage and then archive and share materials that you've put on there. So that's the workflow I'm going to recommend here, is basically using Google Drive or GitHub for your project management needs, and then making a kind of snapshot of that through the Open Science Framework, which will automatically remain up to date and be your sharing and archiving. So for my running example, I've got my project webinar sample OSF site, and I did this simply by creating a new OSF project, and then I've now linked this to my GitHub. And so it provides an archived and shareable link to all of those files that I've organized on my GitHub. So now I have files on my home computer, on my GitHub, And then those are mirrored on the OSF. So it seems like I've got lots of copies, but they're actually all being kept in sync by software. So I don't have to worry about these kind of versioning issues. Okay, so the last practicum, which I'll just show you and then uh, move on from, is to create an account on the OSF and upload this project folder just so you can see what this looks like. You can do that by linking to Google Drive, or you can just do that by uploading projects, uploading project files manually. All right, so last thing I want to say is what my lab mostly does here is we use RStudio for project management. We use GitHub for storing and sharing files, although Google Drive is doable here. We collaborate on writing initial drafts using Google Docs, but then we sometimes move those to our Markdown so they can be in our repository and be reproducible. And then we connect that GitHub to OSF to archive and to pre-register and all of that. So lots of different tools, but working together into an ecosystem where everything is organized around this kind of project hierarchy. Okay, so we answered some questions. I went a little long here, but I'm going to wrap up now, and then I'll stay on for a few minutes answering further questions, and happy to chat as well by email. Okay, so to conclude, what I argued today is that good project management is the foundation of good reproducibility and good data sharing and material sharing and research product sharing. Project management, honestly, it's mostly just about being really purposeful and intentional and naming and organizing your research products well. But once you do this, software like RStudio and cloud platforms like GitHub and OSF can really help you keep track of all of that and prepare it to share publicly. Okay, so these slides are available again at this URL. We encourage you to give feedback on the webinar. So maybe the TAs can share this link in the, perfect, Heidi's got the link in the chat. And then there's much more project management content and other experimental methods content available at Experimentology, our textbook. So yeah, I'll stay on for a few minutes and answer questions, but thank you very much for joining us. We hope this was useful and look forward to seeing you on another webinar.